Salam, peace be upon you. My name is Muhammad Laik Sadiqi, the father of holophase defects as irreducible phi-pattern structure. Before this part, we have already built a long road. We began by saying that pattern is primary, not object first, not law first, not observer first, pattern first. Then we said that at the root of pattern lies phi, the primitive permission for distinction itself. Phi is not a thing. It is not matter, not energy, not a particle, not a mind. It is the most basic possibility that this can differ from that. Then we discovered that phi is circular. Its primitive form is not aligned with a privileged beginning and end, but a circle. That is why absolute values are not public. Only relations are public. Only differences can be shared. Only what survives lawful change can enter public science. Then we disciplined the framework. We said all material assumptions must be declared. Every claim must declare its type. Pattern, claim, certificate, and artifact must be kept distinct. Every claim comes through a window. Every window is finite. The first thing we read is difference. To read local change in a circle-valued pattern, we use local lifts, and from those lifts, we get the first carrier of local change, spoken as A equals d phi tilde. Then we discovered jets, layered local signatures, where a pattern reveals value, rate, curvature, and more, but always only to finite depth. There is always more beneath what we can currently read. Then we learn to read one pattern through three coordinated phases: cadence, texture, and flow. Or, in everyday language, the readout phases that later become time, space, and motion. Then we learn that pattern language has limits. Some operations are lawful only in certain domains. Some regions must be excised. Aliasing can create counterfeit patterns. Boundaries shape what the pattern is. Global patterns are not assumed. They are stitched from local charts through lawful overlaps. And once we stitch, we find global memory, winding and holonomy, the fact that loops can remember something no single local patch reveals. Now we arrive at a startling new truth. Sometimes the pattern cannot be globally smoothed. Sometimes, no matter how carefully you choose your local charts, your lifts, your cuts, your overlaps, and your stitching rules, the whole thing still refuses to become one seamless global description. At first, this sounds like failure, but part 15 teaches the opposite. Sometimes failure is not failure. Sometimes failure is structure. Sometimes what refuses to disappear is one of the deepest truths the pattern has to offer. That is what a defect is. A defect is not a foreign thing inserted into a pattern from outside. A defect is not random noise. A defect is not a data glitch. A defect is not just something ugly that we should smooth away. A defect is an irreducible obstruction in the pattern itself, and that obstruction is part of the pattern's identity. The first intuition, the whirlpool. Imagine a calm river. In one region, the water flows smoothly. In another region, the water begins to circle. A whirlpool forms. Now ask a simple question. Is the center of the whirlpool an error? No, it is not a mistake in the water. It is not a defect in the sense of bad craftsmanship. It is the very thing that makes the whirlpool what it is. If you remove the rotating center completely, you would no longer have a whirlpool. You would just have ordinary flow. So the strange place where a smooth flow breaks down is not an accident around the pattern. It is part of the pattern. That is the right first feeling for defects. A defect is the place where a smooth description cannot continue in the usual way, but that impossibility itself is meaningful. The pattern is telling us something. The second intuition, the crack in a plate. Take a ceramic plate and crack it. The crack has a tip. At that tip, ordinary smooth description of stress and continuity becomes extreme. The whole pattern of the material changes around that point. Now, again ask, is the crack tip just an error in description? No, it is a real structural feature. It changes how the plate behaves. It changes how the plate breaks. It changes how force travels through the material. The crack tip is not outside the pattern. It is inside the pattern as one of its most important truths. A defect is like that. It is where the pattern's own structure says, you cannot smooth me all the way through, and that cannot is not ignorance alone. It is part of what I am. When stitching fails irreducibly. Earlier, we learned that a global pattern is built by stitching local descriptions across overlaps. This means that if you cannot describe the whole at once, you cover it with patches. Each patch works locally. In overlap regions, the descriptions must be lawfully related. If the overlaps fit, you have one global pattern. But now imagine trying this and discovering that the stitching cannot be completed everywhere. No matter what local lift you choose, some region still resists a single global smooth description. No matter what branch cut you choose, some obstruction remains. No matter how carefully you compare local charts, the whole still contains a place or a region around which global consistency fails. That is the birth of a defect. A defect appears when the failure of global smoothness is not removable by better bookkeeping. If a mistaken notation caused the problem, that is not a defect. If poor data caused the problem, that is not yet a defect. If bad sampling caused the problem, that is not a defect. But if after lawful checking the obstruction remains, then the obstruction itself is pattern content. That is defect structure. What a defect really is. We can now say it simply. A defect is an obstruction to one or more of the following: a global lift, a globally smooth description, a fully consistent atlas stitching, a continuous deformation that removes the obstruction without tearing or changing the pattern class. But the key point is this: the obstruction is not merely a limit of our language. It is also a fact about the pattern. The pattern cannot be globally untangled in the way we hoped. That cannot is real. That cannot is stable. That cannot can often be counted, tracked, and conserved. That is why a defect is not just a missing piece of description. It is part of the thing described. 5. Defect is not error. This distinction is crucial. In ordinary speech, a defect means something wrong. In five-pattern science, defect means something more precise and more profound. A defect is not automatically a problem to be removed. It may be one of the most stable and informative features of the pattern. Think of a knot in a rope. A knot prevents the rope from being smoothly straightened unless you perform a definite operation. The knot is an obstruction. But if you are studying the rope as it actually is, the knot is part of the structure. It changes what the rope can do. It changes how tension travels. It changes what motions are possible. The knot is not just an accident from the observer's point of view. It is part of the pattern. Likewise, a vortex in fluid flow, a dislocation in a crystal, a singular core in a field, a topological twist in a stitched global structure. All of these are defects in the technical sense. They are not mere failures. They are structured obstructions. Why defects belong to pattern identity? If two patterns differ only in whether one has a defect and the other does not, Are they the same pattern? No, because the defect changes what can be done globally. It changes loop memory. It changes winding possibilities. It changes how the pattern can be deformed. It changes how local patches stitch into a whole. That means a defect is part of pattern identity. A defect-free pattern and a defect-bearing pattern are not the same kind of thing. Even if they look similar locally for a while, globally they differ. This is why defects matter so much. They are not side notes. They are part of the answer to the question, what pattern is this? 7. Topological charge, how defects become countable. One of the most beautiful things about defects is that they are often not just visible, they are countable. A defect can carry charge. Here, the word charge does not mean a little substance sitting inside a tiny object. It means an invariant label of obstruction. This charge has several important properties. First, it is quantized. It comes in discrete units, not because someone imposed discreteness from outside, but because global closure and topology naturally produce countable residues. Second, it is conserved under lawful continuous deformation. If you smoothly reshape the pattern without tearing it or changing its topological class, the charge does not simply vanish. Third, it is countable. We can often say this defect has charge 1, that one has charge -1, another has charge 2. Fourth, it is localizable. Even though the charge comes from global structure, it can be associated with particular regions or cores. So charge is a bookkeeping system for structured abstraction. It is not a primitive substance. It is a topological signature. The whirlpool again, now as charge. Return to the whirlpool. Walk around it in a loop. As you go around, the flow direction turns around the center. When you complete the loop, the total turning gives you a winding count. That winding count acts like charge. If the loop encloses no whirlpool, the total winding is 0. If it encloses one whirlpool spinning one way, the winding may be +1. If the whirlpool spins the other way, -1. So the defect is not just there is something messy in the middle. It has a countable, invariant, structured property. That is exactly why defect theory is powerful. It turns seeming irregularity into public structure. 9. Crystal dislocations, a concrete physical analogy. In a crystal, atoms form an ordered repeating pattern. Now insert one extra half plane of atoms. The lattice can no longer remain perfectly regular everywhere. A line of obstruction appears. That is a dislocation. The dislocation is not just an inconvenience. It affects strength, deformation, conductivity, and fracture behavior. It can move. It can interact with other dislocations. It can be counted and tracked. In everyday language, one might say the crystal is imperfect. But in serious science, the dislocation is not thrown away as unimportant. It becomes one of the main things to study. This is exactly the spirit of part 15. Defects are not dirt on the surface of pattern science. They are one of the deepest pattern truths. 10. Linking. Defects can remember each other. Defects do not merely exist one by one. They can relate. They can link. Imagine two smoke rings passing through each other and becoming topologically linked. Or think of knots and links in rope. Once linked, they cannot be separated by smooth motion alone. The linking is itself global structure. This means that beyond individual defect charge, patterns can carry higher order global memory in their relations among defects. A single defect may have a charge. A pair or network of defects may have linking structure. That linking is not decorative. It changes what deformations are possible. It changes interaction pathways. It adds another layer of pattern memory. So defects are not just isolated anomalies. They can form communities of obstruction, networks of structured impossibility, entangled architectures of memory, from local trouble to global information. It is easy to think that where a smooth description breaks, knowledge stops. But in this framework, something deeper happens. Where smoothness breaks, a new kind of knowledge begins. A defect tells us that global stitching has a non-trivial obstruction, that local smoothness is not the whole story, that the pattern carries memory beyond local derivatives, that some stable identity content lives in what cannot be smoothed away. So defects are places where the pattern becomes more informative, not less. They are the places where pattern theory stops pretending that smooth local order is enough and starts acknowledging the richer global architecture of the whole. Pattern first, particles later. Now we reach one of the most radical inversions in the whole roadmap. Ordinary thinking often starts with little objects and then says, patterns arise from how those objects arrange themselves. This framework suggests a deeper alternative. Pattern first, obstruction first, stable object-like behavior later. In other words, what later appears as a particle may in some cases be read first as a stable defect structure in an underlying pattern field. This does not mean we should instantly declare that every particle is definitely a defect in every physical theory. That would be too fast and would violate our own rigor. But it does mean the conceptual order has changed. We are no longer forced to say, first there are particles, then patterns. We may now say, first there is pattern, then topology, then defect, and then perhaps particle-like persistence as a later readout. This is a profound inversion. It means the world may not be built from little pre-given things. It may be built from structured pattern whose obstructions become the most stable things we later observe. Why defects look particle-like? Why do defects invite comparison with particles? Because they often share several important features. They can persist through change. They can be counted. They can carry charge-like labels. They can move. They can interact. They can link and unlink. They can be created or annihilated only under specific lawful conditions. They can store information. All of that sounds particle-like. But the pattern-first approach says, do not begin by reifying them as tiny objects. Begin by understanding them as stable structural features of the pattern. Only later, if the lawful bridges justify it, do we speak of particle-like behavior. This protects us from smuggling object metaphysics back into the foundation. Defects are not noise. This firewall matters. Not every messy region is a defect. Not every anomaly is a defect. Not every unresolved fluctuation is a defect. Noise is not defect. Artifact is not defect. Aliasing is not defect. Bad measurement is not defect. A defect claim requires topological evidence. It requires an obstruction basis. It requires lawful loops, lawful domains, declared excisions, and invariant support. If that support is absent, then calling something a defect is premature. This is why the framework needs a defect certification gate. Without that, people would start naming every strange bump a defect, and the whole idea would collapse into confusion. Defects must be earned. The defect certification gate. To certify a defect claim, we need discipline. At minimum, a serious defect claim must declare the lawful domain in which the claim is made, any excisions or cuts relevant to the obstruction, the topological invariant basis used to support the defect, the localization criteria by which the defect region is identified, and, where relevant, the charge ledger and linking map. This means you do not just point to a strange-looking region and say, there is a defect. You must show what global smoothness fails, why the failure is not removable by a better chart choice, what invariant tracks that failure, and why the result is lawful under the declared domain conditions. Only then does the claim become certifiable. This is exactly what rigor looks like at the boundary between local description and global obstruction. Refusal conditions. Because this science is disciplined, it must also know when to refuse. A defect claim must be refused if the obstruction is asserted without proof, the loops or domains used to establish the claim are illegal, the invariant basis is missing, the alleged charge changes under lawful transformation when it should not, unresolved noise or measurement artifact is being mistaken for defect, linking is claimed without a lawful topological basis, or particle language has been imported without first establishing pattern obstruction. These refusal conditions are not harshness, they are honesty. They keep the framework from collapsing into mythology. Defects across scales. The beauty of the defect idea is that it appears everywhere. In fluids, vortices. In crystals, dislocations. In cosmology, cosmic strings and related topological structures in some models. In condensed matter, quantized vortices and domain walls. In biology, developmental folds and structural singular regions may sometimes be studied through related ideas. In social systems, one might use the analogy carefully. Certain persistent institutional bottlenecks or structural knots can behave like pattern obstructions, though here one must not confuse metaphor with certified topological claim. Across scales, the lesson is the same. Where a pattern cannot be globally smoothed in a lawful way, the obstruction itself may be one of the deepest things there is to know. 18. The philosophical lesson. Not all brokenness is error. This part also teaches a broader human lesson. We often think anything irregular must be fixed, anything resistant must be removed, anything non-smooth must be a failure. But sometimes the most real feature of a thing is exactly where it resists our wish for smoothness. A scar is not simply the absence of healthy skin, it is a historical feature of the body. A knot in wood is not merely flawed wood, it is the record of growth under branching. A crack line in dry earth is not a mistake of the soil, it is the shape the field takes under stress and dehydration. Likewise, a defect in pattern science is not simply a place where our knowledge failed. It may be the place where the pattern tells the deepest truth about its own history, tension, and identity. This is why part 15 is so important. It teaches us to stop worshipping smoothness as if smoothness were the whole of truth. Reality includes stable obstructions, and those obstructions matter. What this part installs. By the end of this part, several major ideas are now installed. First, defect ontology at the pattern layer. Defects are now recognized as genuine pattern structures. Second, the distinction between defect and error. A defect is not automatically a mistake, artifact, or noise event. Third, charge bookkeeping. Defects can carry quantized, conserved, countable, localizable labels. Fourth, the possibility of linking a networked defect structure. Fifth, the pattern-first inversion leading toward particle-like readouts later, rather than particles being taken as primitive now. Sixth, the need for a defect certification gate, with rigorous refusal conditions. Seventh, the understanding that defects are not outside pattern identity, but part of it. That is a major step. Because once you accept defects as real pattern features, the world changes. Now, the places where smoothness fails are no longer embarrassing side effects. They become central objects of study. The deep synthesis of the journey so far. If we step back, we can now see the whole arc more clearly. We began with primitive comparability, then circularity, then public relations instead of absolutes, then discipline claims, windows, differences, local lifts, local signatures, triunity readouts, lawful domains, boundaries, stitched global identity, loop memory, topology, and now defects. Notice the direction. We did not begin with objects. We did not begin with particles. We did not begin with time and space as containers. We did not begin with external laws acting on ready-made things. We began with the most minimal permission for distinction, and by following that permission carefully, step by step, with firewalls against smuggling, we reached a world in which stable, object-like features can emerge from pattern itself. That is extraordinary. And defects are a crucial turning point in that story, because they show how something can become stable, countable, and persistent without having been primitive. A defect is a first glimpse of how things can arise from structure. Where this leads next. After defects, the framework needs a pause. We now have enough pieces for a first full synthesis. We have gone from primitive phi to topology and obstruction. Before moving into the deeper treatments of identity, persistence, and change, the framework must gather what has been built so far into one clear whole. That is why the next step is a synthesis step. Because once defects are installed, the foundation is no longer just abstract. It now contains local readability, a scarce global memory, stable obstruction, and the seed of object-like persistence. That is enough to pause, look back, and assemble the first full essence of phi pattern science. Imagine a woven carpet. From far away, you see a smooth design. Up close, you see threads, crossings, directions, local color changes. If you inspect carefully enough, you may also find knots, twists, pulled regions, and places where the weave cannot be flattened without changing the carpet itself. Those are not mistakes floating on top of the carpet. They are part of how the carpet is what it is. The world in this framework is like that. Pattern first, smoothness where lawful, memory in loops, and where the weave cannot be globally straightened, defects appear. Not as accidents, not as foreign invaders, but as irreducible structure, as the pattern's own way of saying, here is one of the deepest truths about what I am. Always, peace be upon you.